My name is Jennifer Nagel. I teach philosophy at the University of Toronto, and today I want to talk to you about 3 ways philosophers have tried to solve the problem of skepticism: the Cartesian way, the Russellian way, and the Moreian way. The Cartesian way comes to us from René Descartes' Meditations, published in 1641. You'll recall from the last video that Descartes dramatizes the skeptical problem with a scenario involving you and an evil genius who is determined to send you all kinds of misleading impressions. After stirring up maximal doubt, Descartes asks whether there is anything you can know for sure. What about your own existence? Hey, it looks like the evil genius couldn't possibly deceive you about that. For him to deceive you about anything, you have to exist. As long as you're thinking about anything, you can know for sure that you exist as a thinking being. It's not easy to leverage this one item of knowledge into a larger solution to the skeptical problem. But Descartes notices there's one more thing he has at his disposal as a thinking being. Whether or not he's being deceived, he's aware of a great diversity of ideas within his mind. Although at this point, he's not yet sure whether these ideas represent anything real. He observes that some of his ideas represent greater and lesser things. And his greatest idea of all is his idea of an infinite and perfect being. That's an amazing idea. In fact, it's so amazing, Descartes thinks, that it couldn't come from an imperfect being. The only possible source for such a great idea is an infinite and perfect God. So God, therefore, exists. Now, if the universe is run by a good and all-powerful God, Descartes argues, we can't be trapped in an endless dream of unreality or left in the clutches of an evil demon who deceives us all the time. When we think carefully, Descartes maintains, we'll see that the skeptic's global bad case is not really possible. An evil demon can't possibly exist in a world with God, and we can prove this. God clearly plays a very important role in the Cartesian response to skepticism. And from the start, critics have raised worries about Descartes' way of trying to prove the existence of God. In particular, it's not obvious that he's on safe ground as he reasons about the sources of his ideas, if he's still at that point supposed to be taking very seriously the idea that there could be an evil genius distorting what seems true to him. But whether or not you like the Cartesian strategy, you might wonder whether meaningful responses to skepticism have to take the very ambitious step of trying to show that the skeptic's bad case is flat out impossible. A different strategy would be to allow that the bad case is possible, but then argue that we still have very good reasons to think it isn't actually real. This is Bertrand Russell's strategy. Unlike Descartes, Russell thinks you can never have an airtight logical proof that anything is real beyond yourself and your experiences. And, in particular, it's logically possible that your entire life is a dream. However, Russell argues, we have no good reason to accept the hypothesis that we're dreaming, and at least 2 good reasons, to accept the common sense hypothesis that our experiences come from ordinary physical objects. First, the common sense view is simpler, Russell says. It's the best explanation of the regular patterns in our experience. Second, common sense is our starting point. The existence of the outer world is one of the instinctive beliefs on which all knowledge is ultimately based. According to Russell, we're only entitled to reject an instinctive belief when we discover it's inconsistent with other instinctive beliefs. But our belief in the outer world isn't like that. If we believe in a real outer world, we can come up with a perfectly consistent scientific story about how perceptual experience generally works, and even about how dreams are ordinarily caused. Russell thinks that the skeptical argument is powerful enough that we should feel a slight element of doubt in any judgment we make about the outer world. But he also thinks that our reasonable judgments are still strong enough, even with that shadow of doubt, to count as knowledge. Skepticism is a remote hypothetical possibility that doesn't bar us from gaining knowledge through ordinary sense perception, or more systematically, through science. Some critics of the Russellian response to skepticism have wondered whether he's entitled to say that the existence of the outer world is the simplest explanation of our experience. After all, there's something simple about saying that all experiences come from one evil genius, rather than from millions of outer objects. Other critics have wondered whether it makes sense to talk about having knowledge while keeping a shadow of doubt in the picture. Even if Russell makes a case that it's simple and reasonable to have common sense beliefs, it's not entirely clear that he's given an adequate defense of the notion that these reasonable beliefs should count as knowledge. If you're looking for a response to skepticism that sweeps away doubt, you may prefer the Moorean approach. G.E. Moore doesn't think you have to prove that God exists in order to know that there's an outer world. And he doesn't even think you have to reflect on the ways in which the outer world provides a good explanation of your experience. If you want to prove that the outer world is real, just look at your hands, or your legs, or any objects around you. Here is one hand, and here is another. Hands are external objects, therefore, external objects are real. If the skeptic suggests you don't really know that your hands are there in front of you, Moore says you should fight back by accusing him of being ridiculous, and you should brush off his demands for proof. Sometimes you can know things, like the fact that you have hands, without being able to prove them. Similarly, you can just know that you aren't dreaming right now, even if you can't prove it. Something odd about Moore is that he says you can prove that the external world is real, while also saying you can't generally prove that your hands are real. But notice that the claim about the external world is the kind of general theoretical claim that philosophers make, and the claim about your hands is a very basic fact about particular ordinary things. The fact that there's a hand in front of you right now is so basic, it's hard to think of anything more basic you could point to as a reason to believe it. If the skeptic tries to undermine common sense everyday knowledge with some fancy philosophical argument, you should have doubts about that argument and not about basic common sense. So, Moore actually agrees with the skeptic that if you were in the bad case, dreaming in a vat, then you wouldn't know there's a hand in front of you. But he points out that this is a big if. Moore thinks your common sense knowledge would only be in trouble if you were actually in the bad case, and the skeptic hasn't proved that you are. The flip side is that if you really do know there's a hand in front of you, then you know you're not in the bad case. The outcome of the battle between Moore and the skeptic depends on your starting point. If you start with common sense, Moore looks pretty good. But even if you like the strategy of being stubborn in the face of skepticism and clinging to common sense, you might wonder about why skepticism ever felt appealing. And you might wonder whether the skeptic is making some mistake that we could diagnose, or whether skepticism might even be self-undermining. The next video in this series explores these questions by looking at 3 more contemporary ways of trying to solve the problem of skepticism.